The Honourable Member for Saskatoon West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to let you know that I'll be splitting my time with the member for Hochelaga. Mr. Speaker, it's been over 3 years since the Minister of Families, Children and Social Development was mandated by our Prime Minister to develop a national housing strategy, and just a little over 14 months since the release of that strategy. Many of us, me included, after a year-long build-up to the final reveal, thought we would see a strategy that would be transformational. What we got instead were underwhelming targets for reducing homelessness, and most of the funding coming after the next election well into the future. But what we needed was a national housing strategy that would be big, transformational, because our country is in a housing and homelessness crisis. The homelessness and housing crisis of today is the direct result of the withdrawal of both Liberal and Conservative federal governments from affordable housing over the years. In 1993, the then federal Liberal government ended new funding for affordable housing, and thanks to this ill-conceived leadership, many provinces followed suit. And so we managed the problem of homelessness due to a lack of affordable housing with emergency services, shelters, and hospitals. It is a very expensive housing system, both the human costs and financially for governments and communities. This is the legacy of Liberal and Conservative federal governments, an expensive and ineffective emergency housing system. Today's motion is about ending the federal government's rhetoric and their pats on the back when it comes to housing and homelessness, and demanding that we face the reality of this national crisis with real federal leadership, real action, real and immediate investment. 1.7 million Canadians are living in what policy people call core housing need. That means a population of Canadians almost twice the size of Saskatchewan are paying more than 1/3 of their income for housing that is substandard, not in good repair, unsafe, and overcrowded. And of those 1.7 million, 400,000 Canadians are paying more than 50% of their income for poor quality housing. I call that a crisis in need of bold and immediate action. The National Housing Strategy so far has overwhelmed us with a lot of fanfare, but underwhelmed me in particular with actual results. Very little housing has been built. Operating agreements and rental subsidies have been temporarily extended, but many nonprofit housing providers, especially those providing tenants with rent geared to income subsidies, remain in precarious financial situations. Unable to fix and repair their affordable units and provide the needed rent subsidies, these affordable homes are at risk of being lost. This country has an annual capital repair deficit in excess of $1.3 billion annually. This affordable housing is a lifeline for seniors, newcomers, people with disabilities, Indigenous peoples, and other vulnerable Canadians. Most of what we have seen so far is a rearranging of current dollars with nominal new investment, more of a tinkering around the edges of the crisis. Many of the repackaged programs need cost matching from provincial governments, but after 14 months, only 3 provinces and 1 territory have signed the bilateral agreements. With 10 years of austerity from the Harper Conservatives, the federal government deficit and debt cutting just simply moved that debt to the provinces. Provinces were left scrambling to fund higher health care and social service costs as the federal government cut important support programs. The ability of many provincial governments to match federal investment will be limited, and therefore the big dreams of the National Housing Strategy may be greatly hampered. The National Housing Strategy is not legislation but a government program, and therefore it has been very difficult to scrutinize the government's claims about the level of investment and the actual outcomes, like the number of affordable housing units built, repaired, or maintained. This government has made it extremely difficult to get a handle on what is being done and what the level of investment has been into housing and homelessness. We've had a lot of marketing-type communications, but very little real information provided in such a way that elected officials are able to hold this government to account for the promises they made. And there are real-life consequences for people for this lack of transparency. And what I mean by this is there are consequences to the government's never-ending announcements with little actual concrete action. We've heard about the Canada Housing Benefit, but have not been provided any detail to who it will help and how it will work. Unfortunately, that didn't stop the Sask Party government in Saskatchewan from quickly ending the provincial rental supplement last summer, citing the federal government's new Canada Housing Benefit, a benefit that will not come on stream until after the next federal election. The median income in my riding is just shy of $40,000 a year, and so I have many constituents who depended on the provincial rental supplement to have a home, to make their housing affordable. With the end of the provincial rental supplement and no replacement anytime soon vis-a-vis the federal government, I have many constituents who are remaining in unsuitable, unsafe housing, putting up with slum landlords for fear that if they move, their rental supplement will be reassessed, they'll be considered a new applicant, and therefore not eligible for a benefit that now no longer exists. Mr. Speaker, governing is about priority. Today's motion is asking this Liberal government to make affordable housing for Canadians the priority for this government. A government that has rearranged and renamed funding programs, a government has put minimal new dollars into building housing in comparison to what is needed, that has underwhelmed us with unambitious targets for homelessness reduction, has not made affordable housing and ending homelessness a priority. Mr. Speaker, it's hard not to think about what if. What if our past Liberal and Conservative federal governments had made affordable housing a priority every year? One could imagine if only the investment and leadership by past federal governments had been maintained. Instead of ending affordable housing, we would have had an additional 650,000 affordable housing units in this country, perhaps even more. But we can bemoan the past, but what I'd rather do is have a government who is seized with this issue and getting down to the hard work and making the tough decisions it will take to pull our country out of this national crisis. This government still has time to step up. Today's motion is not about postponing investment and action, but about immediately ramping up our response. Safe, affordable housing is such a foundational piece for the quality of life for families and individuals, for our children's welfare, for healthy and thriving communities, for businesses to grow. When housing is unavailable and unaffordable, businesses can't recruit employees. When families struggle with housing, we know from the research that the state of a family's housing is a factor in 1 in 5 cases when children are admitted to care. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to end my comments on a more personal note. I believe I'm here today as an elected member of Parliament in large part because my family benefited from accessible, affordable housing. When my parents were first starting out in Brandon, Manitoba with a young family, we lived in subsidized housing. That leg up early in my parents' life together meant my mother was able to finish her postgraduate psychiatric nursing program while my dad began his career. They were able to save a bit of money, even in those early days, that allowed us as a family to weather the inevitable financial ups and downs of life. It meant I never questioned if I'd be able to afford university to become a social worker, the education that brought me here today as an elected member of Parliament. It is for that reason and the many other reasons I have mentioned that affordable housing and ending homelessness must be the priority for this Liberal government. And we can start today by supporting this motion and once again showing federal leadership on the #1 priority for Canadians, a safe, affordable place to call home. Thank you.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Families, Children and Social Development.
Thank the House very much for the opportunity to speak about housing, and once again pay my respect to the member opposite, who has been a tireless advocate for better housing policies, stronger housing policies, and has sustained the debate in this House, and to that I give her thanks, because for all of us who are fighting to create the strongest national housing program possible, we need the good ideas of the sides opposite, as well as the voices of people who, as she has said, have come through lived experience. The question I have for the member opposite is to start to detail out their program. I recognize that they're calling for 500,000 units of housing. half of which are to come after 5 years, which is not after one election, but after 2 elections. But I just have the question that really I think needs to be answered, which is this. CMHC and housing advocates and housing suppliers across the country peg the cost of providing a house at 80% of market value at $350,000 on average across the country. Of course, it's much higher in Vancouver and Toronto, where land values drive a different equation. But the question is this. Based on the simple math that they've produced, that means their housing program would cost $175 billion, half of which would have to be spent this year. And I'm just curious as to where they're going to find that money. And secondly, they said they're going to subsidize every Canadian in core housing need, which she said was 1.7 million people. Where is that dollar figure, and where are they going to find those dollars this year?
For Saskatoon West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank my colleague for his questions, comments, and for his acknowledgement of my work here in the House and in the community. I think what we are asking the government to do is to actually face the issue of the crisis in housing with an actual plan that actually matches that crisis. The idea that you make housing a priority around the cabinet table means, and I understand, you make difficult decisions and you have to do some things and not the other. I do believe the Minister and the Parliamentary Secretary believe that there is a crisis in housing. I do believe that they are making that case around the cabinet table. What I'm asking them to do is to make that case better and to bring their colleagues along. I do think the money is there. I do think we have to make decisions. I do think we have to ask everyone to pay their fair share of taxes because it is a crisis, and that is where I believe the money will come from. But the first place it comes from is a government that makes it a priority and makes decisions to do that instead of other things. Thank you.
Hello. Questions and comments. The honourable member for Kootenay, Columbia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I would like to also thank my colleague for her tireless advocating for housing and affordable housing across Canada. So yesterday in question period, yesterday of course was Mental Health Awareness Day. I raised the issue and the particular challenges faced by people with mental illnesses around housing. I did meet with a woman in one of my communities who is living in a storage unit, had that confirmed afterwards by some of the municipal people. And I wonder if you could talk just about the need for enhanced funding for both mental illnesses and housing and the relationship between the two.
For Saskatoon West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank my colleague for the opportunity to comment about how foundational housing is and how it is interrelated and many other issues that we face in our community. When I was becoming a social worker, we started to talk about the impact of homelessness on people's mental health, and that was a long time ago, 30 or 40 years ago. But I think what's happened is when we have pulled out the support for affordable housing, those who are most vulnerable were impacted first. And we developed a very expensive system of just picking up people's lives almost literally on the streets. And, bringing people into hospital, helping them, and putting them back out on the street. I think when you talk about making housing and homelessness a priority, you do start to prioritize those people in our community who are most vulnerable now. And I think the idea that someone does not have a stable, safe, affordable place to live has an extremely a big impact on their mental health, and it really holds people back on being able to move forward in their lives or to become healthier or to deal with mental health issues. So it is a key foundational piece. We could really make a huge difference in this country to so many people if we made housing and homelessness prevention a priority. Thank you.
Reprise de débat.